Hi guys, and welcome to my shader setup tutorial. The purpose of this tutorial is to explain to video game artists that you don't have to use the render button up here or hit the F9 on your keyboard to create a good looking image of your art. You can just as well use the 3D Studio Max viewport without ever having to wait for renders, without ever having to do complex lighting setups. Instead, you'll be using the way it's done in video games. Now, before we start, let me point out that my timeline is gone here, and that is because we will be using expert mode. Expert mode can be activated by hitting Ctrl X, and you'll notice that the toolbar and the command panel are gone. So right now the viewport is completely in focus in the video. I'll be using shortcuts a lot, so I'm going to bring up the material editor by hitting M. Here it is. And you'll notice that the material assigned to my submachine gun at the moment is a standard material with a diffuse set to show in viewport. This model is completely finished. All textures are done: normal map, specular map, diffuse. If you want to follow along, make sure you have something like this to work with. Now, we won't be using the standard material. We'll be using a shader instead. A shader is something that's used in video games all the time. When you see objects in video games that have reflections, that have shadows, that have highlights, they always use shaders. Shaders are small programs, and these programs are used to calculate every pixel of the model that it is applied to. Now, don't be afraid that I say program. It's actually, as an interface, just like a material file. Now, how do we use a shader in Max? Since version 8, Max has had support for DirectX shaders. And you can actually load up these shaders by pressing this standard button for your material. And then the material map browser shows up, and you'll notice this pink orb here, which is a DirectX shader. We'll just double click this, and it asks you to replace the material. Discard or keep. I'm just going to keep it. It doesn't matter so much. You'll notice that immediately your model changes. The texture is gone, since we're actually rendering it with this shader now instead of the standard show map and viewport display. Now, up here you can see that it has loaded a file, default.fx, from the 3D Studio Max directory. This is an actual shader. These are the parameters for this shader. It's very limited. You can't really do a lot with it. I'll just change this one to show you the point. Change this to green, and you'll notice immediately the gun changes to green. Now, this one's really limited. You can't even load a texture in here, so we're going to change this to a special shader. The special shader is a shader that I've programmed myself. I've made it available to everybody on the internet to download and use inside 3D Studio Max. If you want to get it as well, a link will be provided together with this tutorial for you to download and use. Hit this button to load a different shader, and I'm going to go to the directory on my computer where the shader is. And there's two versions that came with my shader, the 1.3 no shadows and the standard 1.3. This one has shadows, this one doesn't. This one is merely for faster loading, since shadows are slow to load as an FX file, but also because Max 8 and 9 don't have support for shadows and will give errors if you open the 1.3 standard version. I'm going to be using the no shadows version. Click open. You notice the object changes again. It's reset all the parameters, and right now you'll see that a lot more parameters have appeared here. It's a huge list, and we'll be using most of these. Now, if you rotate around your object, you'll see there's a specular already, and the object is already lit also. Now, what we need to do is set up lights, load in our textures, and change parameters like reflection, specular values, and everything. I'm going to be going over all of those and explaining you how and why I do these things while I'm at it. First thing we're going to do is load our diffuse map back. We scroll down a bit to the diffuse map section, and there's a diffuse map with a none button here. This none button is a button for you to load textures into a shader. If I hit this, 3D Studio Max opens a file browser, and I'm going to be going to the folder where all my textures for my gun are stored. I'm going to choose the diffuse texture and click open. It takes a little while to load. Now, don't panic that it's not showing up already. My shader has the ability to toggle maps on and off, so you can instead use a default value. Right now it's using default gray. I'm going to enable the texture by checking this tick box. And there you go, my texture's been activated. Now it doesn't look so great yet, very flat, very fake. That's why we need more maps. I've also created a normal map. I'm going to scroll down to the normal map section, hit the normal map button, and load up normals.tga. I'm going to check the normal map box as well, and immediately the normals show up. Now there's a little bit of a problem here. You can notice with this text. Right now it looks like the text is actually coming out of the object, but if I look like this, it's like the text is inside. There's a little bit of a discrepancy between how the normal map is saved and how it's used. You need to flip the green channel. You can notice there's a small change and everything looks like it should. This is already starting to look more like a gun you see in a game, but it's still very much plastic-like. The reason for this is because the specular is a uniform value all over. If I scroll up, there's a specular color here. You can actually change this to different colors. If I want pink specular, I can get that. But I'm going to reset that back to white. And we're going to load a map instead. Same way we've done before. Open up specular.tga and check the spec map button. Right away we can see that the specular map is working already, and that the specular is a lot more interesting already. We need to load one more file that I've created, which is a glossiness map. If I click gloss map, I can load up glossiness.tga, and there might not be so much change down here, but that's because of these values over here. I'm going to be expanding the range of the glossiness map a lot more. Right now, white is 25 glossiness level and black is 10. There's only a difference of 15 in between. That's tiny, so I need to up this to almost 500. And you can immediately see a change. You notice how the metal is a lot more dull than the wood, which is quite shiny down here. So this looks about correct. Maybe I might lower this a little bit more. Doesn't matter so much. Okay, there we go. We've loaded up the basic settings for our gun. There's a lot more we can do here. One of the very cool features of my shader is that you can actually use Fresnel Effects and Reflections. It's the section all the way at the bottom of the shader. You can toggle all of these effects on by checking Use Fresnel Reflections. If I check this, you can see some interesting effects appearing. It looks like this object is slightly reflecting an environment around it. Now this is not what we will be using. This is more meant for car paint like materials. See, you can actually see this reflection here. We're going to be using a cube map. Now a cube map is a very special file which is some sort of reflection environment. A cube map is loaded just like a map down here. We have a cube map here. I'm going to click this and go to the correct folder on my PC to load this file. These cube maps have to be DDS files. You can see here a little preview of it. It's a blue sky with clouds and a sun and a black environment around it. I'm going to open this, and you see it's not being used yet. It's still using the standard white reflections. I enable this cube map by checking Reflect Cube Map, and immediately you can see that the clouds are being reflected by my weapon. Now you might notice this looks a little bit fake. I mean, the gun isn't supposed to reflect like it's made out of chrome. We have to change that. Now how do we do this? There's a few parameters you can influence here. First of all, there's a Fresnel multiplier here, which multiplies the strength of the reflections. This cube map is actually multiplied by 2 by this Fresnel multiplier. There's also the bias and the power. The power determines at how much of a sloped angle the reflection will start appearing. You'll notice if I look at it like this, there's no reflection. If I look at it like this, it's reflecting very, very bright. You can change this actually by increasing this number or lowering it. You'll notice it looks absolutely disgusting this way. I think about 4 should be good to start with. And I also want a little bit of a bias here. I'm going to be upping this to about 0.05. Yeah, this is starting to get somewhere. And actually I want my reflections to be a lot more blurry on the metal than it is on the glossy grip here. You can do this by checking use gloss map for blur. Right now it's not doing anything because you need to set a maximum blur for the cube map. Now this is a bit of a special value. It's going to pick a lower resolution version of your cube map and use that for reflection instead. This doesn't go up very high. The higher you set it, the more it blurs. About 6, 7, 8 is the highest value. It depends on the resolution of your cube map. I'm going to be using 6 here. You'll notice that things have changed a little bit. You can see how the reflections jumped to a more blurry version. This might be a little bit high. I'm going to lower this again to 5. Yep, that looks better. Maybe I'm going to try another cube map here. I have some more. One of those is beach.dds. This one is actually on my site up for download. Since this is a free cube map, it's provided online for free. I've just converted it to a real-time format. Now you notice this one looks a lot more fun already. You can see this nice highlight appearing on my gun. And at the pistol grip here, things are a lot more sharp. Yep, this is starting to get somewhere. I'm gonna say it again, these Fresnel reflections pretty much add most of all to your object. You really need to think about using this. Even if it's a dull object like dull metal, it still reflects slightly. It really helps bringing out details like these normal map only details. The back here really works well on cylinders. Now you'll notice one thing, there's still a white highlight from the specular appearing here. Why is that? 3D Studio Max is still using the default light and passing that through to the shader. You'll notice here light 1 position is set to default light and the active lights is set to 1. You can up the number of active lights. You notice it gets brighter. Why is this? You can even set it to 0 if you want. Then just the reflections work. That's quite interesting to see also. You'll see how just a gloss map, a spec map, and a cube map with normal map can look really, really good already. I'm going to increase this again. There we go. Now if you set it to 3, it's going to use the default light 3 times. I actually want to place some lights and specifically use these. So I'm going to go out of expert mode and close this to place some lights. Activate my grid so I can see what I'm doing. Then set this to standard lights. Create an Omni Light here. And I actually want the Omni Light to resemble the color of my cube map, which was a slightly warm orange. Don't increase the saturation too much, just set it to a slightly warmer color. There we go. You can see the shader is already slightly using it. With Ctrl L you can switch between this. So there we go. I'm going to be moving this light a bit over there. A little bit higher. Now the reason I'm placing it there is if I rotate this object, the sun should be somewhere over there, because I can tell by the reflections. There we go. Back to expert mode, disable grid, activate material editor, and I'm going to be setting the first light to Omni 01. You notice how the object is now lit by this Omni Light only. To be moving it a little bit more, a bit up. And now I want the specular to match with my reflection. You can see that should be about right. Now the other side of the weapon has gone very, very dark. That's not entirely correct because the cube map we're using suggests an outdoor environment, and outdoor always has a lot of bounced light around. You can't do any fancy global illumination like you could do with renders, but you can fake it. For this you can use ambient. Now ambient is indirect light, light that will come from everywhere. If we set this to something else than black, you'll notice the gun gets brighter and brighter until it becomes fully lit everywhere. Now a solid value like this can work in some cases, but I'm not such a big fan of this. Instead, you can also use a cube map for the ambient, so that it will sample light from the cube map and use that to light your object with ambient light. You can do this by checking Use IBL Cube Map for Ambient. IBL stands for Image-Based Lighting. You get your lighting from an image, a cube map. I'm going to check this, and then I want to share Reflection Cube Map. I don't want to load it twice, I want to use the same one, so I'll check this. There we go. You can immediately see light is being used for the ambient of my object. This cube map is the same one as the Fresnel cube map down there, but it's actually using a different blur value. It's using 6 as a blur. You want to set the blur very high. I'll show you what happens if I set it low. You get these very weird sharp colors on your object, which aren't really recommended. Let's see if I can set this to 7 even. Yeah, 6 is better. 7 is too high of a value for this cube map because of its resolution. You can change the cube map strength by changing these sliders down here. Set it lower, put it to something like 0.35, and it's still a bit dark here. Let me increase that. Yep, that looks better. Alright, so we want to add some more lighting in here because our cube map alone isn't enough to do everything. I want to add another light, a blue one from the top, that simulates the sky a little bit, that shines on this weapon. Again, I'm going to close this, go out of expert mode by hitting Ctrl X, going to the create panel and creating another Omni Light. I want to move this one directly above the weapon. I'm going to place this high, and this guy's color has to be warmish blue. I'm going to have to tweak this value a little bit. So first set it into this shader by choosing Omni 2. You'll notice no effect. That's because the number of active lights is still set to 2. Increase this and there you go. Blue is popping up into my shader. This object is starting to look lit pretty well. I'm going to reduce this a little bit to 0.75. Doesn't do much, but it's worth a shot. There we go. Ctrl X. And starting to like where this is going. You can now pretty much look around your object, look at how the reflections are working, marvel at your work. And my advice for taking screenshots with this this type of thing is you want to have very strong highlights for contrast on your shots. For example, this one, this is really great. You have this big highlight here, brings out the details. Maybe it's a little bit too much. Rotate a bit like that. There you go. I really like this shot. Now, how do we save this? You can take a print screen, go into Photoshop, crop that out, but 3D Studio Max offers you a better way to work. I'm going to go out of X-ray mode so you can see this. There is a Tools, and you can go to Grab Viewport. It asks you to add a label. I never do this. I always hit Grab. And then it brings you up with a rendered window that is exactly what you saw in the viewport. Now, the resolution of this grab is actually directly the resolution of your viewport. So going into expert mode and hiding your animation layer, make sure you can actually make bigger screen grabs than you did before. You'll notice this one is a lot bigger. That's a little bit of a downside. of using viewport screen grabs, you don't have control over the resolution. You can actually set how big you exactly want your image to be. But you can just save these in the same way as you've done before by hitting the save button with renders. And that's pretty much all there is to the basics of setting up a shader. So to reiterate, make sure to set the correct lights. Don't forget the active lights button. This is actually placed a little bit in a bad position. I'll change this in future versions. And make sure to make good use of Fresnel Reflections. These cube maps can be downloaded at my website. You don't actually need them. There are some settings here, like disabling use hard type world masking. This is for some sort of rim light like you see in Team Fortress 2. It's pretty much possible to simulate Team Fortress 2 in my shader, especially if you use the Half-Lambert shading here, which is the special shading model created by Valve. If you check this, you see the lighting gets a little bit softer. It's hard to see on a noisy next-gen object like this, but it's very, very obvious if you create characters like in Team Fortress. A cartoony guy or something could work very well. And don't forget to enable maps. And actually my shader also has support for opacity, but you want your opacity to be in the alpha channel of your diffuse map, and you can just check this to use it. Right now there's none, so it's not working. The global opacity level is for global opacity. I can set this to half to get my object looking like a weird see-through thing. Don't want to do that. And there's also a specular global control. I can actually reduce the specular value by hitting 0. You see specular is all gone. You can even boost it by multiplying it by 2, but 1 is a good value most of the time. If you don't use a map, you can change the specular with the color and the level here. Now there's also self-illumination support. To finish this off, I want to show you a few examples of other scenes that I've created with this shader. For example, here, this is a car I've created. It's a Ford Mustang, and this scene was entirely set up with my shader as well. You can see why render if it looks this good in the viewport. Chrome reflections, everything is there. And it's actually just better to show your work with this kind of method as a game artist, because it shows you can get things working in real time without fancy render tricks. And then again, my shader can also be considered as a fancy trick. Now, I'll open up another scene just to show you guys. I mostly do cars, so this is another car. This one has a gloss map also, opacity, self-illumination for the lights at the back here. I've used a rim effect on these exhausts. There's a normal map on the wheels. Just look at that. Specular works really well on this car's body since it has so much fun detail. And to go back to the previous file, there's a few tricks you can do also in Max. The shadows I talked about, you might have noticed them in this file. There's a real-time shadow on the floor here. I think if I rotate this car, yeah, well, you can see the shadow updating. How do you enable these shadows? Well, first of all, if you place a light, you need to right-click it with the light selected. This is being annoying. There you go. You need to enable cast shadows. Let me do it this way. Cast shadows needs to be on, and then you need to enable viewport shadows down here. There's a little bit of viewport bugs. Viewport shadows is over here. You need to enable this one. Once that is enabled, Max will cast shadows on objects with a default material. If you use my shader, then you need to load the shadows version. Let me do that. 1.3, which has a few more options. These are it. You need to set this shadow term 1 to the light you want to be casting shadows. This light needs to have cast shadows on, and viewport shadows on. As soon as you've done this, you can set use shadow 1, change the blur value for soft shadows, the intensity, and how much the shadow blurs in the distance. Now another thing to note in Max, before you get the shadows working, you need to go to configure viewport, lighting and shadows, and set this one to best. You can also have the default light cast shadows here and set the global shadow intensity. It's very important you set this to best. Now, all of this was in 3D Studio Max 2009. In 3D Studio Max 2010, a lot of things have changed. Let me open that. This is a file I've been working on also. You'll notice over here the names of this viewport have changed, and the way you activate this sort of stuff here is by clicking this one, the last piece of text, and you can enable hardware shading here, enable shadows, enable ambient occlusion. You can choose transparency quality. You can actually configure all of this. This is all really new in Max. Enable ambient occlusion, set quality settings here, the radius. Two types of shadows here. Little remark, my shader only works with hard shadows. If you set it to soft shadows, then you will get no shadows at all with my shader. And here you can choose the good best like I just showed you in 2009. Now I'll just show you a few more options here, but trust me, it's gotten a lot more complex in Max. This is an engine I've been working on. I'm using this one as an example because it's such a complex object and it benefits a lot from a few settings. If I disable shadows, it gets a lot more flat, but it gets even worse if I disable ambient occlusion. See, the object gets really flat and loses some detail. If you enable ambient occlusion again, you can see these corners all get a little bit darker. Now this ambient occlusion is a new feature in Max. It's pretty heavy. You need a good graphics card to run this. You can see mine is running at 50 FPS. It's a GeForce GTX 280, so if you have something lower, watch out. Now that we're talking about hardware, my shader is a pretty heavy shader, and it uses shader model 3, so if you have an ATI X700 or something, then no, it won't work. Also, if you have a GeForce 5 series, though I doubt there are many people that do still, then my shader will also not work. As another remark, my shader's been known to act difficult with ATI cards. Some people might have problems here. I use it myself on a laptop with an ATI HD 2600, and that doesn't give me any problems, but to be sure, a GeForce will pretty much always work. Now, that's about it for showing you what you can do with viewport shaders. If you go to 3D Studio Max 2010, you get a lot more fancy options, but even with 3D Studio Max 2009, even the normal old 9 version, you can get some pretty nice results. So I hope you learned something from my video, and just go download that shader and experiment a bit with it. Thanks guys, see ya.